Welcome to the Supported Living Property Podcast with your host, me, Lisa Brown, the place to learn about supported living property investing. Hi Grant, it's great to have you here today. Thank you for coming. How are you?
I'm well, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a bit about you, Grant?
Sure. So my name's Grant. Grant Erskine. I'm director of an architect's practice. To give you a bit of a background, it's probably the easiest way to explain how I got to where I am is just a quick run through of where I came from. Left school mid-A levels, much to the pleasure of my parents. Was in a good grammar school, decided I wanted to get a job. Applied to be an architect and a bin man on the same day. By chance, the architect's office phoned back first. Went in, bottom rung, folding drawings, making coffees, worked my way up in the practice to the point where I was sort of designing, delivering several hundred house schemes. This is sort of late 90s Northern Ireland. Doing night classes, did an HND in building studies. Somebody said you should go to university, and that's probably not for me, but applied. I always tell people this because I always think I'm a great believer in you don't know what's for you, what's going to happen. Don't worry too much about it. I applied to one of the best schools of architecture and I was accepted. And I didn't even know that it was one of the best schools of architecture. I'd been a DJ for about 10 years and I thought if university was a bit shit, I'd live it up in the clubs in Manchester for a year. And that's how I ended up in one of the best schools of architecture in the world, actually. I had a hugely, how should I say, very, very high work ethic because I'd been working 9-to-5 job. I've been DJing a couple of nights a week and I've been studying night classes. So I found university pretty easy. I always say this to people, it's not hard if you put the work in. The only time it's hard is when you're not putting the work in. And I found it, I was able to party every night. I'm 23 and I'm going up with a load of 18-year-olds partying every night and still getting up and going to classes and everything else. And so achieved highly in my first degree. Went to work for a company called BDP, Building Design Partnership. Again, one of the best of the best. I've always said, you don't say no to BDP. If they offer you a job, you take the job. Worked there from a year out, went back to do my part 2, which is 2 days a week in, kept my hand in, working 3 days a week at BDP. So I was doing a full-time degree and working 3 days a week at BDP. Came out after year 6, straight back to BDP full-time. They say you can be an architect in 7 years. Of the 200 odd students that started in, 2003, only 2 of us sat that exam 7 years and 1 month later, me and one other who was a mate of mine. I qualified and was made redundant in the same month in October 2010. And this would have been nobody was hiring, no jobs. So I had to go it alone. And that was a do or die moment, I suppose. And yeah, oh goodness, back bedroom of a house, laptop, 2010, no work around, scratching a living, doing anything and everything. And that's quite key. I always said I would just sorted out people's shit. If you had a problem, I'd sort it for you, And this is what I did in the early days. I was picking up a lot of bits and pieces from people, from architects' practices. They didn't know how to do it or didn't want to do it or that sort of thing. And got a name for myself, networking and everything. It's got a name for myself. It's just being the guy to work with, the guy to go to. 2-3 years in, got a little office, hired my first staff member. In fact, I think it was just before I hired the office, got a phone call one day and the guy says, I want to do an HMO. Can you do it? Oh, yeah, no problem. Right, come and see me here. Live in a big mansion down in Prestbury. Come see me. Went fine, hung up the phone. First thing I did was Google what's an HMO. And the thing is, I knew I'd been doing student accommodation in Liverpool, so I was doing them. I just didn't know the phrase HMO, but that's typically me. Can you do that? Yeah, no problem. And then Google. And yeah, his principle, his thing, he wanted to do the best HMO around. He'd always done £1 million houses, one-off £5 million houses, wanted to do the best HMO around. Me being me, I brought a whole load of investors, potential clients to see it. And you want to see this place, it was beautiful. We did raised mezzanines, kitchenettes, en suites, luxury, video, doorbell, the whole shebang. And we quite quickly went to being the go-to practice for HMOs. We've done a couple of hundred of them now and everything else. But what we've always said is we work with investors. And this is where I'm getting to the core point. We work with investors, so we do whatever is fashionable. So 3, 4, 5 years ago, we would be seeing we would expect to see 2 to 3 new HMO projects a week. Probably now more 3 to 4 HMO projects a month. The trend has dropped off. They're not as fashionable as they were. And we were there right through sort of HMO, then into serviced accommodation. Remember that boom for about 18 months, which, yeah, that's gone for a while. And then a couple of years ago, assisted living became a lot more popular. We'd already done a couple of assisted living projects, but I don't think investors were really starting to tap into it. And actually in the last year, sort of since COVID, the more traditional actual apartment developments have become a lot more fashionable. So it's all waves and ups and downs that you follow the trend of what investors want. And that's how we've sort of gotten known as being the go-to practice to help investors make the most out of their money.
Fantastic. From the supported living or assisted living, and I think that's one of the things we were talking just before this started, weren't we, about the terminology, and that actually there isn't one clear defined word that you must use. But for the properties that we're talking about with supported living, what's different about those when you're designing those? What are the different considerations do you find?
The big thing, and this is something that I say all the time, and I think I said it on the conference you did a couple of weeks ago. From my perspective as an architect, there's not a huge amount of difference, but there is one big massive thing. And from an investor's perspective, there's not a huge amount of difference except for this one massive thing. And the best way to explain it is we will often get a phone call where somebody say to me, I want to do assisted living, or I want to do supported living, or I want to do something in that world. And the first question I'll say to them is, okay, do you have your end user in place? And we go, no, what's that? All right, that's the first thing that you need. Because, and I always use the same example of a client that we work for. And his model is always the same. He goes and he finds a demand first. He'll go and find somebody, an operator. He will then say, well, what do you need? What's your requirement? He will then find the building. He'll then come to us and he'll put us in touch with the operator. And we work through him, but we work for the operator. So for him, we have done 8 apartments for a small charity on the Wirral for disabled adults, where we got quite niche with the requirements of each adult as well. Like one adult, for example, had a real infatuation with running water, so it would often flood the premises. So designing for that individual. Also for him, we looked at we designed a large dementia care unit in Kidderminster, dementia and bariatric care in Kidderminster. We also looked at a young adults one in East Manchester. Now, from him, the model's exactly the same. Find an operator, find a building, deliver it, hand it over for 10 years or whatever it is. But for us, it's very, very different, because the actual charity in the Wirral didn't have a huge amount of specific requirements, i.e. space standards or anything like that. But they had very, very detailed requirements on what they wanted on an individual basis. Whereas the dementia care, they were going for a higher level CQC rating, a Quality Care Commission, which, and I didn't know this, but just chatting to the guy, if they tick certain boxes, they're able to get higher rental. So it was a rethink of I think it was I want to say it was like a 70-bed care home, like an old-fashioned care home, that we were rethinking into, I think it was around 58. In essence, we made all the rooms bigger, give them all en suites and that sort of thing. But from the client's perspective, exact same model, but from our perspective, hugely different. So what we generally say to people is you need to have your exit in place first. Then everything else falls in quite easily behind.
Absolutely, because there's such a variety of different support needs, aren't there, for the individuals and therefore their property requirements. If we're looking at young adults leaving the care system, potentially they don't need anything else other than a private rental. Maybe some of the operators require slightly higher fire standards or safety, but like you're saying, sometimes when you've got very bespoke requirements, like that individual who was a little bit fascinated with water, and you have to then design that around those needs, then the needs are very, very different, aren't they?
Yeah, and we had another one where the operator wanted all the plasterboard walls to be fully pattriced. Pattricing is timber lining, a sheet of timber behind the plasterboard. Because some of the users would have a tendency to lash out a little bit and damage stuff. And they found from experience that one of the requirements was timber line all the stud walls. If you don't know that before you have engaged with that person, there's no way you would guess that, because you wouldn't do it. So you wouldn't qualify for that operator. So yeah, having the specific requirements of your operator is immensely important in knowing what your next step's going to be.
Absolutely, because you can take that shell, can't you, of an old commercial building or that old nursing home or whatever it is that you're converting, and then really understanding it. But I think, and also understanding, like you're saying about the space standards, is really, really key, isn't it? Because a lot of people have a perception that actually a large HMO is what's needed, and actually the move is very much away from that. And what we're seeing more and more is that requirement to have individual units, people having their own front door, and then some shared facilities or some staff on site. And then people think, oh, well, it's fine. Well, I can cram people into tiny little, 15 meters squared flats. We'll put these tiny little flats in.
Yeah.
And actually, also planning won't let you get through with those anyway now, will they? So
I remember doing one years ago where the operator, they were very, very prescribed in what they wanted, that they wanted each apartment, one bed apartment, to be 50 square meters. And it wasn't really based on anything.
no.
But they even went to the length of saying that they wanted the layout to be like this. They wanted the kitchen to be like that. They wanted the radiator to be so far from the adjacent wall. They got really, really prescribed. But something as arbitrary as, we want every apartment to be 50 square meters. You don't do it, they won't use your facility. But there was no possible way you could have guessed that, because under the National Housing Space Standards, a one bed flat needs to be 37 square meters or 39. They just like bigger flats for their tenants.
And it's interesting because I've had that conversation with one organisation fairly recently, they work with quite highly disabled, physically disabled adults. So they were like, so our clinicians have said our flats need to be 50 meters squared for a one bed flat. And I said, but why? And they were like, oh, because that's what they've said. I said, is that because I said you can design a really good, fully accessible flat for 40 meters squared? Oh, can you? Oh, and so sometimes you do have that clash when the clinicians have very, very high, rightly so, very high standards, but sometimes slightly unrealistic, which will never match a property investor. And then the organisation's going, well, why can't we find the properties? Why can't we find property developers who'll develop schemes for us? And you do always have that slight clash. I'm sure you've had that on sites with, whether you've got they almost want gold-plated taps because that's the best thing for their individuals. And lovely as that would be, actually, that's not ever going to work for anyone's budget. So.
That is actually interesting, because with that client I mentioned earlier on, I'm often put in the scenario of in between my client, i.e. the building owner and developer, and then their client, and their client wants everything, because they're seeing it as an opportunity to get everything put in not for free, but put in as part of the delivery costs, which they're not, it's different budgets and what have you. And then I've got my client on the other saying, what do you mean the one, well, gold-plated taps is the one that often comes up, actually, is because but it's things like CCTV and stuff, and then they've got the client asking, do they really need CCTV? I don't know, to be honest with you, but it wouldn't be normal, shall we say, but they're sort of seeing it as an opportunity to just cram in every little extra feature that they can get in.
I mean, sometimes some operators do require some CCTV in communal areas, for safety, for monitoring and stuff. And, but there is also a conversation to be had about actually what you pay for as a landlord and a property developer, and what the operator would pay for, what the organisation taking the lease on your property. And, there is a balance to be put in there, isn't there? Where actually, And
that's often we will advise that, because a lot of times we will get the spec sent through and the client won't 100% understand everything that's being asked for. And we'll sort of say to them, do you realize that you're signing up for XYZ here? And they'll go, well, is that a problem? I go, it's not a problem. It's just got a huge cost implication for you. And then all of a sudden it becomes a bit more less, because it's not always set in stone. Some of it is negotiable, and depending who your operator is. But of course, your operator is going to ask for everything that they can get. Of course they are.
And that's, I guess, where your role's key, sitting in the middle there in those negotiations and trying to help people to understand both sides of it. Because I think that's something that we find we're doing an awful lot at the Gateway, is just helping these two different groups understand each other, because everyone's kind of coming from their own angle, aren't they?
Yes. And it's not easy. It's not even, we even did like on the very, very, I would say the simplest level, in Manchester's Article 4, and their strict Article 4. And then we have a very small scale operator. They actually are the operator as well, and they'll do disabled care for adults, but the client is from a clinical background, and she operates them herself. Well, she has staff, but she's not the investor handing it over to somebody. She's actually the operator. And just the hassle that we have getting planning approval for adults living, maybe a big house in a nice area, But for disabled adults living in it together, you can't actually do it without changing the clashes. And the last one that we did, they insisted that the planning only existed while she was the operator. I've never seen this before. Ooh. Once they stopped operating, if they sold the building, it had to go back to being a C3 dwelling. So they actually gave, I've never seen planning approval associated with an individual or with a company.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that was to put it to what classification, Grant?
That was it was a care facility. Would that have been a C2? C2, I think it was, yeah, C2.
Because sometimes they go C3B, don't they? They can be for HMOs that are shared care.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was. So we didn't worry too much about what the use class was. It wasn't important to her. It wasn't important to us. So we just said facility for disabled adults. And we did actually no build work. Their requirement, it had 2 big bathrooms in it. It had 4 bedrooms in it. It had a space for their office, had a good kitchen, had a good dining room. They didn't build work wise. Nothing was done particularly. But getting it through the planning was the real challenge. And as I say, it is associated with that operator and nobody else.
That's interesting. I guess perhaps if they've done their due diligence on that provider, they're happy with them, feel that they would provide a good service. And
I don't even think they went that far. No, I just think they were worried more that it was a backdoor into trying to turn it into a C4 HMO.
Right. Okay.
Because Manchester is exceptionally opposed to any sort of. They have it in policy that they're very opposed to breaking up of larger family homes into smaller units, whether that's HMOs or apartments.
Okay.
So it does make Manchester. It's interesting because we're a practice based in Manchester Council, and over 10 years we've probably done maybe 5 jobs in Manchester Council. And it's a small council, but I'd say we've probably done 5 jobs in it. Now go a couple of miles north into Salford Council, and we've done hundreds, I'd say.
Interesting.
Yeah, they've done 100 projects in Salford.
Yeah.
But it's Manchester's quite a hard council to actually work in.
And I do think when you're looking at the planning with supported living, it's interpreted differently in different areas, isn't it? It seems to be. It isn't a national, this is how it should be for supported living. It certainly seems different areas have different interpretations. And again, different tenant groups have different requirements. If you're looking at children's homes, they need to have that C2 for Ofsted, don't they?
We generally advise, just from a commercial perspective, to try and do it under C3, just because it gives you multiple exits. That if something goes wrong for whatever reason, if the operator ceases to exist or pulls out of the deal, or you're in a 5-year agreement and in 5 years they decide we don't have the demand in the area and they move on, that you're not left with something that you're going to have to work on again to make it an income generating asset. So with it being C3, and there is there's a slight grey area of, if you take a block of C3 flats, can you really use it as a care facility or not? It's never really been tested. We've asked this of a few of the sort of the major operators, and they push it. They want it to be C3 because it works for them. That's what I said. But you have a live-in manager and live-in care. Is it C3?
It's really tricky. I think generally also the interpretation is because the staff on site are not, it's not like a caretaker or a warden living there. It's a rotating shift basis, isn't it? So I think that's sometimes where they get around that. It's not live-in care, it's on-site care. But you're right, and I don't think there's been any test cases to prove that at all. It's certainly the scheme that I'm doing at the moment down in Plymouth, that's C3. It's going to be 13 flats. One of those flats will be a staff base, and the other 12 will be people with mental health problems. But that's, that again, it's C3. That as a developer gives me comfort, because actually if the scheme falls over, I know I can do it as private rental.
Yes.
But yeah, it's complicated, isn't it?
And it's one of those, there's no appetite to test it, I suppose, because there is requirement for the accommodation. So if I often think like everybody's crapping over HMOs at the minute because of a very small minority of shoddy landlords, and everybody has the same principle. It's going to be prostitutes and smackheads. I've done hundreds of HMOs, and they're always luxury, high end, and they're always generally regenerating an area. And every client, and maybe it's self-selecting, that if you're using me, you're probably a more sophisticated or decent individual client. Obviously, yeah, you're an absolute if you're using me. But I'm quite evangelical. I've went away a hard word I can't say. I speak out about this quite a lot, that I don't see bad landlords. And I actually feel really sorry for them sometimes because they do get the rough end of the stick. It seems to be every year they're getting taxed a little bit harder or pushed a little bit harder by planning or vilified a little bit more. And the vast majority of people I see are just people who are trying to make a living and doing a job. You know, they're not sitting in their big mansion up on the hill, you know, drinking their brandy at 3 o'clock.
I wish, yeah.
Because and this is the other thing that I try to bang on about is that being a developer, it's not armchair. I see this on Facebook, armchair developing.
Passive income, isn't it, Grant? Surely that's what this is.
We'll all be making 6,000 a month within 2 years. It's like every investor I know, every developer I know, they work bloody hard.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you were saying just before we started as well about your life cycle of developers. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? What you
so we have a theory, and it's not for everybody, but it is we do see it quite a lot. That we have a theory, a belief that we only generally see about 3 to 3.5 projects per individual. And you're going to say to me, how can a project do half, or how can a client do half a project? But if you took all our clients, the number is going to be somewhere between 3 and 4 in how many projects they do. And the reason behind it is that they'll start with a cash sum, a lump sum, let's say 100 grand. And that's enough operating cash to get them going on their first project. And they're going into it hopefully hoping that they're going to get all money out. And when I talk around the different networking events, I always say, hands up how many people have actually had all money out in the last 3 years. And you might get one hand, or out of 100 people, one hand, maybe 2, because it's really hard to get all. In fact, it's practically impossible. It's like unicorns. You don't really get it these days, all money out, because the banks aren't stupid. They want you to have skin in the game. 5 years ago, all money out, it was quite easily achievable, but now it's not. So they've done their first one. They've had to leave 30% of their working capital in. They've probably had the up value and everything else, but they've still, whatever way they've done it, had to leave 30% of their money in. So they've got 60 grand left, 70 grand left to do their second one. They've got enough to get going on their second one. And again, they refinance it, but they've had to leave some of their cash in. They get to their third one, and this is where they're starting to get really strapped. And we do see it happen where they're becoming a lot more budget conscious and cash flow conscious. And then by the time they've done that one, they've got 3 good assets generating an income, but they've no working capital left. So they can't do the fourth. So, and their income, their rental income, it's good, but it's not good enough to replenish the funds. So we do see a lot of people will do, and that's in every sector, whether it's, if you're developing to hold, whether it's HMO, whether it's apartments or whatever, generally by the 3rd or 4th project, that's where the money runs out, if you will, the actual working cash runs out. And when we see it a lot. So if you take anything away from that, it's something to maybe just bear in mind in the back of your head, that if you don't have another income stream coming from somewhere, just realize you're going to run out of cash.
Yeah, so I think it's not the dream that you're sold on training property courses.
No,
people come out thinking they're gonna. Yeah, absolutely. We could talk about that one for hours, I'm sure, Grant. But
yeah, I go to them sometimes because it's in some cases quite easy pickings for me. I just go with a handful of business cards, and if I don't do it as much now as I've got kids and stuff, but because it's usually a Saturday in a hotel room smelling of vomit from the prom disco the night before, which that's not my phrase. I heard that once before. I thought it was a great way to explain it. But this all money out. It's not armchair investing. It's not easy. It's not.
And you add supported living into that, and actually it makes it more complicated. So
And this is the thing. When people go in open-eyed and they run it like a business, they're the ones who are the successful ones. They're the ones who do well because they realize this is a business. It's a very lucrative business. You can make a very good living out of it. And it's funny. I often go back to a client that I worked with for years, and he always seemed to find the unicorn shit, the real, the stuff that didn't exist, the perfect deals, and people used to say to me, how do you do it? Or say to him, how do you do it? He says, I'm just really good at finding them. And I said to him one day, how do you do it? People don't realize that I will look at maybe 500 projects and then go and view 50 of them to offer on 10 of them to get one. He says, but I'm spending days and days, 14-hour days in the background, just scrolling through the dross to find it, And a lot of people think it's just some magic go on Rightmove for 10 minutes and boom, there you go. It's going to turn up, you know.
It just
But,
isn't, is it? It's hard, and particularly in the market at the moment, it's very hard finding the deals.
Oh, and then when you layer it up, well, let's just make it even more of a sub story. The price of property is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But the price of building work is absolutely, and this is something I've been starting to say a lot more. If you're stacking your deals based on construction costs from even 6 months ago, you need to really, really look at it. And we've had one recently where we took the quotes in back in November. The builder, I think, had come in at, let's say, 96 grand, a small HMO, 96 grand. And the client sort of dragged their heels a little bit on giving them the nod, but we got there in February and said, right, we're all good to go. He said, I'm busy up until April, but we can start in April, end of March, early April. End of March came around. He says, I'm still busy. We want to push this into May. And I think we'd agreed sort of 7th, 8th of May, we're going to sign contracts. 2 or 3 days before we're supposed to all meet on site, he rang me and said, I can't do it at 96. I need it to be 123. That's nearly a third uplift. And I've worked with this guy for 12 years. I know what he's like. He's not taking the piss. He's being stupid. He says, labor rates, he said, joiners that I had 6 months ago that were on 165, 170 a day are wanting 220 a day. Decorators are wanting 265 a day. He says, the labor has went crazy. He says, but materials have also, he says, I'm being told there's an international timber shortage.
Yeah.
You know, and I would suggest to people that if they are stacking deals now based on numbers from last year, to really add a chunk in, maybe add 20% in, just to give yourself the headroom that if it still works at that, you're not going to come unstuck.
Yeah.
Because what I think we're going to see happening is a lot of people buying properties at auction at the minute at overinflated prices, thinking that they're going to save it on the build cost. Then when the tender, they're going to realize that the build cost is 30% up on where they hoped it would be, or not even where they thought it would be, but they want to save it. And you're going to see quite a lot of properties coming back into auction, I would say.
Who knows, but I do feel that's what we're going to start seeing, because it's just, it's very toppy. There's no space for anyone. No. Grant, thank you. Is there any particular tips or advice you'd say for property investors who are looking at supported living? Anything they need to think about when they're looking at supported living from your perspective?
The more time you spend in your due diligence in your desktop, and the more rigorous you are, the more likely of a successful scheme. So, looking at, firstly, the big one, what your operator wants. That's quite key. But then also when you're looking at the building, look at planning constraints, look at the physical constraints around the building, look at what's about it as well, see if there's going to be any issues, see what the opportunities are as well. And just be really, really stress test it as much as you can. Don't dive in hopeful and on a wish and a prayer or whatever it is to say, just get as much, look at everything that can possibly go wrong. And then if you're still thinking there's a good chance, then push the button.
Brilliant. That's great advice. Thank you, Grant. It's been brilliant talking to you today. Thank you.
Pleasure.